Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be all about political persuasion and how political information works to affect people's opinions. And my guest to discuss this is Professor Alex Coppock. He is an associate professor of political science at Yale University and has recently authored the book Persuasion in Parallel: How Information Changes Minds About Politics, published by Chicago University Press. And what's interesting about this from a social media perspective is it helps us understand how political ads work. When candidates pay tons of money to advertise on television or social media, how much actually are they moving people's opinions? So we'll get to that, but as traditional fashion for this podcast, we won't get to that before discussing some of the theoretical concepts and arguments about how Professor Coppock got to start studying these things. And in particular, one of the main hypotheses out there for how information works is motivated reasoning. And this is the idea that if you see something you disagree with, you're more likely to be entrenched in your own opinions. But Professor Coppock's research actually shows the opposite, that persuasive information does work, it does change people's opinions, but it just moves them a little bit in the direction of that information. And so after a discussion of these key concepts and methods that Professor Coppock uses in his research, we'll talk about some studies where he's focused particularly on the effectiveness of political ads and digital political ads in American elections. And we're talking about the cutting edge of social science research for measuring the persuasiveness of political ads. So Professor Coppock has done studies measuring the effect of multi-million-dollar ad buys, or even using internal data from Swayable, which is where campaigns test the effectiveness of their digital ads. Actually, what is the effect? And spoiler alert, for those who don't hang around to the end of the episode, it's less than 1%. So in this episode, we'll dive into how political persuasion works, why motivated reasoning is wrong, and get to some empirical studies that quantify the effect of digital political ads in the real world. And of course, there'll be links to all the studies we discussed down in the episode description. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Alex Coppock, Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Coppock, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks, Michael. This is great. I'm so glad to be here.
So you've recently conducted a number of studies analyzing the effect of digital ads on persuasion. But before we dive into those, I think it's important to outline how political persuasion works in general. In your book, Persuasion in Parallel, you present dozens of experiments that point to a similar pattern, which you call the persuasion in parallel hypothesis. Can you outline that hypothesis for us? What does it mean to say that persuasion occurs in parallel?
So the parallel lines are a visual metaphor for the standard reaction when a group of people encounters a piece of persuasive information. So those people will have wildly diverging views on what we should do about a particular policy question. So they start out in different places. Then when they encounter persuasive information, which is a particular kind of communication information treatment, when they encounter that kind of thing, they update their views a little bit in the direction of information. And since people with different baselines update the same small amount, if you draw out what that looks like, it looks like two parallel lines. So that's what happens when people encounter persuasive information. They update in parallel.
And there's many of these graphs that show these parallel lines in the book. But you also write there that this whole line of research starts with your graduate studies in a famous psychology paper from the 1970s. And that paper essentially argues that persuasion attempts can have a backlash effect, which ends up leading to this whole idea of motivated reasoning. So can you describe these concepts of motivated reasoning and backlash, as well as the problems you found with the original studies that developed them?
Yes, I sure can. It's my favorite topic. Okay, so what we're talking about is Lord Rossen-Lepper, 1979. This is a really famous paper that is like the go-to citation when people want to express the idea that when you encounter information that is counter-attitudinal, you actually don't move towards it, you move further away from it. So this persuasive attempt is counterproductive. So what happened in that 1979 paper is they brought people into the lab, 48 Stanford undergraduates in 1970 something, and half of them were pro-capital punishment, half of them were anti-capital punishment. They were then exposed to pro and anti-capital punishment arguments. And then the experimenters asked them, okay, on a scale from -8 to 8, how much did your mind change? And the people who were pro-capital punishment used values that were higher on the scale, and people who were anti-capital punishment used values that were lower on the scale. And so then that demonstration became the go-to citation for the idea that people update in opposite directions. So there's a couple of problems with that research design. And so apologies to your listeners. Of course, the academic dispute is going to turn on a methods question. So this methods question is the design of their study, which is bad in two ways. The first way is that they did not randomize exposure to the treatment variable. Everybody saw the same stuff. So there's no control group in this study, which makes inference hard. The second thing they did in order to get around that was they asked their subjects to tell them what happened to their attitudes as a result of the treatment. So you're exposed, and then oh, how did your attitude change? It turns out that people are extremely bad at inspecting their counterfactual attitudes and then rendering the difference to the experimenter. So you can't just ask somebody how something changed their mind because they don't know. That's not a causal inference question that a person can answer by themselves. What they do instead is they use that -8 to 8 scale to give the level of their opinion. And so pro-capital punishment people used higher values and anti-capital punishment people used lower values to express that they still supported capital punishment or still opposed it. So that interpretation of that measurement approach, I validate that in later work with Matt Graham, showing that that kind of change format question leads to very bad bias. So that's just to say that this core study from the 70s that became the justification for this thing we all feel, which is that sometimes when you argue with people, it's counterproductive, that you end up further apart than when you started. That became the scientific justification for that feeling.
Right. And so you actually took this experiment and sort of replicated it through randomization, fixing these two errors, and then what happened?
Right. So you alluded to this grad school origin story. Andy Guess and I are sitting there in political psychology class, and we realized these problems with the Lord et al. Study. And so we did an experiment where we randomly assigned people either to what Lord Ross and Lepper did or a control condition, and then some other conditions besides. So then we can be in control of the treatment variable, which is exposure to information. And when we did it like that, we saw that when you see more pro-capital punishment information, you become more pro-capital punishment, regardless of where you started. If you see anti-capital punishment information, you become less pro-capital punishment, regardless of where you started. So you get the opposite result if only you randomize the treatment that you're interested in.
And this story takes such a spot in the book. And in the acknowledgments, you mentioned that you had a hard time getting this correction of this famous paper studied. And I'm just curious if you could give us some details on why you think it was so difficult to show that this randomization change really flipped the results of this prior study.
So the first reason is that, for crying out loud, Andy and I were graduate students. This was our first study, and we did a million things wrong in the ways that graduate students do things wrong. It was too complicated. Our write-up kind of missed really nailing what was at stake. So in retrospect, I understand how that paper could have been better because I worked so hard since then to make it better. At the same time, I think that there is less weight given to replication studies than there ought to be. So if you take an old study and show that it's wrong, people kind of yawn. So that's one reason. Another is the sort of maybe possibly more interesting reason is that people really believe the attitude polarization and backlash idea from motivated reasoning. That's like a core understanding for many political scientists that there's going to be resistance and reactance, which is going to cause people who encounter information with which they disagree to further entrench. And so it's required a lot of evidence in order to overcome that point of view, which, and I think the tide is turning. Now I don't hear people, or as soon as someone, as soon as someone claims backlash, someone says, but persuasion in parallel. And then when you look into it, it turns out the treatments don't quite meet the definition of persuasive information, like it's got a group Q in it or something like that. Or the outcome measurement isn't about the policy attitude, but instead some rating of the evidence of the person. And that's an important point that I'd like to just quick touch on, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
When you encounter persuasive information and it's counter-attitudinal, so it's something that you don't like, just to fix ideas, imagine that it's a MAGA Republican being forced to watch MSNBC, right? Like they are encountering something that they dislike. If you can get them to watch, they will update their opinions in the direction of the evidence presented on MSNBC. They will move in the leftward direction. If you ask them, how is your experience today? Did you like it or not? They'll say that they had a very bad time. So that would be the prediction of persuasion in parallel, is that you move in the direction on the policy attitude, but on the affective side of things, how much you enjoyed your experience, how much you like the person talking to you, how much you like the evidence itself, those things go down. So that's it's important to understand that political trade-off, which is that you can persuade people, but you piss them off.
Interesting. And, I think what these various studies that you conduct in the book sort of point to is the power of randomization as a sort of method. And, we've heard a lot during COVID about randomized controlled trials being the gold standard in medicine research. And in many ways, I think your approach really follows the same principles, but for social science. And what these experiments do is they isolate, as best we can, the effects of some treatment. So could you outline for the listeners the general logic of a randomized experiment and how you measure treatment effects? And I know from taking one of your courses, there's a big difference between the average treatment effect and a conditional average treatment effect. So can you go into those as well?
Okay, so first we're going to do why you need an RCT, and let's just focus for the moment on the average treatment effect. So if you were going to do a non-randomized study, you would compare people who were exposed to the persuasive information to the people who aren't. And the major trouble there is that the people who are exposed and aren't differ in other ways. And so you can't tell whether it's the exposure to the information or whether it's background differences. And since we know, especially in today's fragmented media economy, that different kinds of people select into seeing different kinds of things, this selection problem means that if you don't use an RCT to try to study media effects, you're always worried that there's some uncontrolled difference between the people who come to be treated and the people who don't. So I was radicalized. At the same time I was taking that political psychology course, I was TAing my advisor's experiments course. And so I've just been radicalized to do it the experimental way since I was a young pup. What an experiment does is it takes a group of subjects and then flips a coin. Some of them are going to get the treatment and some of them are not going to get the treatment. Then we just compare their answers to post-treatment questions. The only difference between them on average can be the treatment. Okay, so from that, you don't get the effect for any particular subject. You only get the effect on average. So here is where the big question for persuasion in parallel comes, because we're not interested in the average effect. We're interested in saying, is the effect similar or different for people who start out on the same side as the argument or the people for whom it's counter-attitudinal, so proponents and opponents. You want to know whether the effects are similar or different for them, so you need to go to conditional average treatment effects, i.e. the effect among those subgroups. Now, the big problem is that when you start slicing your data sets into subgroups like that, the uncertainty goes up quite a bit. So that is a first cut explanation of what the experiments are doing and what targets we're after, which is the conditional average treatment effects.
Yes. And I think it's important to also talk about the treatment, which in this case is persuasive information, which is defined by having both a target and a direction. So can you give us some examples of what persuasive information looks like in today's politics, as well as the type of persuasive information that you treated your participants with?
Great. So the definition you gave is perfect. What I'm trying to say is these are facts and arguments that have a target attitude. There's some policy attitude that is trying to move. So imagine that there is an immigration policy. You're trying to change people's opinion about whether we should have a more liberal or a more conservative immigration policy. And then you're going to use arguments about, like, if we were to liberalize our immigration policy, we would be less cruel to people crossing the border. Or if we were to tighten up our immigration policy, fewer Americans would lose jobs to immigrants, right? So those are like pro and con immigration arguments that have a target attitude, which is how liberal or conservative you want the policy to be. And they have a direction that they're trying to move it in. There are some things that don't count as persuasive information. And like the biggest class of thing that doesn't count is a group cue. A group cue is not an argument or facts about why you should hold a particular policy position. A group cue is Republicans support the immigration policy, right? So you're finding out what some group in society thinks rather than finding out a reason why you should hold that particular policy position. So that's the big distinction that the book turns on, is some kinds of political communication are persuasive information and some kinds are group cues.
Yeah, and you've done this similar experiments with different forms of this treatment, right? Like one, for example, is an op-ed. Another one is a digital ad. And I think what's interesting is that you basically kind of find that regardless of what is carrying this persuasive information, it seems to have a similar pattern, a similar effect.
It really is kind of crazy. I don't have any evidence that one mode is better or worse than another. Like when we look at video treatments, or we look at audio treatments, or text-based only treatments, or text plus graphic treatments, or any of these variations, I'm not seeing a consistent pattern. Now, in some particular cases, this particular treatment has a slightly higher effect than that other one. One of the difficulties is that there's that difference in mode of like how the content is delivered, but also this collection of experiments, it's not like it's the same information delivered across 4 different modes. So we haven't held everything else constant, whatever. When you're thinking about mode, and I think that mode is a really fascinating question because of, I just want to back up this the causal model of persuasion just one bit before talking about mode. So the experiments in persuasion in parallel are all conditional on contact. Every single one of the people who is in the experiment, I'm pretty sure they were exposed to the treatment if they were assigned to the treatment. Whereas in the real world, when I don't know, assign someone to get a digital ad on their computer as they're browsing around the internet, I'm not really sure if they see it or not, right? I'm not sure if they pay attention. And so that is the secret sauce, I think, that we as political scientists have not really nailed, is what are the features of a treatment that cause people to pay attention? And that might vary by mode.
Yeah, and I think, we've had some digital campaigners on this show that point to this problem exactly. And what they do, if they have the budget, is they pay for a YouTube pre-roll ad versus a Facebook ad, because people are going to be exposed if they're looking for how to fix their broken faucet or how to, do whatever. They want to get to the information. So even though a pre-roll ad on YouTube is much more expensive than a Facebook ad, you're ensuring that someone is sound on, engaged, because they want to get to the content behind it. So that's super interesting that challenge is one that you face. And I want to get to digital ads, but there's still a couple of conceptual things I want to kind of clear up before we get there. And one of those is about the durability of these effects, right? It's not that these effects last forever. They do have some decay. So what has your research shown about the durability of these effects over time?
Awesome. So I have to confess that durability was the very first thing that I was looking into when I started this project. I was a graduate student. I was like, I don't know. Nobody knows anything about durability. So I'll just replicate these experiments and see how long the effects last, right? I was a very anti-theory graduate student, and all of my advisors were like, Alex, you need to pay more attention to theory. And I was like, I don't know. I'm just going to do the experiments and see where that takes me. Of course, to finish the book, I needed to re-encounter theory and synthesize. So you get there eventually. I just took my pretty time. On durability, the critique of lots of these survey experiments is, sure, you can get something to happen in the lab. You can get, if you force exposure to some treatment and then ask questions 10 seconds later, it can be top of mind for the person and they'll change their answers to something different from what they would have been if you hadn't given the treatment. That makes good sense as a critique because you want to know if you're like, I studying persuasion, it ought to last a little bit of time. So the only design innovation here was to re-interview people 10 days after the treatment. And this is hard to do because people are like, you take an online survey and then you need to be re-invited, blah, blah, blah. And so there's some attrition. And so there's extra uncertainty associated with these estimates. However, when we do it, we see that on average, it's about a third to a half as strong after 10 days as it was immediately after treatment. So it's not like it completely evaporates, but there's no question that the persuasive effects go down over time. So no, they don't evaporate completely. It's still statistically significant after 10 days, but who cares about statistical significance? We're talking about magnitudes, and it's about a third to a half as big. There's two more things to say about durability. One is a natural question is like, do some treatments last longer than others? And one way of categorizing them is whether or not these things deliver new information that is like unknown to the person. So it's like a new consideration versus frame what you already know to like emphasize some things over others. So those are like every treatment is a combination of those two things. Like it's impossible to have exclusively new information, and it's impossible to, when you give new information, to not highlight things that people already know. So framing is always happening a little bit. We think that the framing effects are more ephemeral and the information effects last a little bit longer. I categorized these treatments before I did the experiments and pre-registered which ones I thought were which. And wouldn't you know it, I was a little bit right. But more things differ about these treatments than just whether they're information or framing treatments. So I don't take that to the bank, but it's possible that some kinds of treatments are more durable than others. One last thing I want to say about durability is what happens after 10 days. Does it keep decaying or does it flatten out? I only had one experiment in which I measured again at 30 days. So it was immediately after treatment, 10 days, and then 30 days. And the pattern there really surprised me. It looks like a hockey stick. Like it goes down immediately by about 50% from immediate to 10 days. And then between 10 days and 30 days, I don't see any more decay. It's still about 50% after 30 days. So the just so theoretical story goes like this. The information arrives as a bundle of salience and information. The salience part burns off, but the information remains. That would explain the hockey stick pattern. Many other things would too.
Mm. And so we've set the kind of conceptual ground, I think. Let's move into some of your studies focusing particularly on political ads. And we'll get to digital ads, but I think first it's important to look at political ads because you have this nice paper in Science Advances that has a sort of rolling panel of people. So you didn't treat them on social media, but you used ads that were actually being used in the 2016 election. And so you varied different parts of the ad in terms of like their content and who sent them, and tried to see whether those aspects of the ad itself mattered for persuasion. It did this over 59 randomized experiments. So what was the idea behind varying the features of the ad, and what did you find overall in that study?
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I love this paper. It's with Lynn Vavrick and Seth Hill. And Lynn and Seth deserve outsized credit for the conceptualization of this study. Their goal was to, throughout the election, keep your finger on the pulse of what kinds of messages are working with voters. And so every week, I think it was Lynn, looked at all of the advertisements that the candidates had released and then picked one on the Democrat side and one on the Republican side to test that week. So it's a 4-group design of a control condition. You only see the Democratic ad, you only see the Republican ad, or you see both. And so eventually, we ended up with 59 separate advertisements that were treated over the course of the election season, which was pretty cool, with nice balance across primary and general, and nice balance across Republican and Democrat. So then all we did was measure support for the target candidate. So negative ads were supposed to decrease support for somebody, positive ads were supposed to increase support for somebody. What did we find? The overall average effect immediately after treatment was a 0.7 percentage point effect.
So less than 1%.
Less than a point is like the average effect of an ad. And I just like, to me, this right here is basically, that's like 95% of what anyone needs to know about the effects of political advertisements. Even in controlled conditions where you are definitely exposed to the advertisement and that we can measure your attitude so there's no attrition, this is like a best case scenario for finding an effect, and the average effect is 0.7 percentage points. So it's small. Then our question is, it's small on average. Is it a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller depending on features of the ads or features of the kinds of people? And our basic conclusion is no, that there's not an ad out there that is a 5-point effect ad. There's probably not an ad out there that's a 3-point effect ad. Like maybe you could get up into the 1.5 or 2-point effect for a really amazing ad, right? But like that's the range of it all. And it is not the case, like it works for people in the middle, but it doesn't work for partisans. We don't find any evidence of that kind of heterogeneity either. So this paper is it stands out in my memory because it's like, finally, we have the meta study that lets us study all of the ads all at the same time. And we can finally answer all these questions about whether or not it's going to be different if or different under these particular conditions. And we just find sameness across ads.
Which is notable, I think, in this American presidential context of Trump and Clinton, because, I mean, if anything, these are going to be the most expensive ads, right? These are going to be the consultants that are, top of ticket. And even there, only 0.07%.
That's right.
Increase.
Can I just tell you one other story on that very subject?
Sure.
So the next study here was based on a data set from this technology company, Swayable, which is the place where these campaigns on the left go to test out their creative, right? So you're like, I don't know, we need to do an ad buy. We need to figure out what our creative should do. So you send off like your 4 best ideas to Swayable. They do a survey experiment and they tell you which one is the best out of the ads that you sent them. They did that under an agreement that they could share those data with academics. So we got a hold of the Swayable database. Now it's 617 advertisements, and the average effect is a 0.8 percentage point effect. And when we look for variation, it's funny because we have enough ads now that it's true that you can get a statistically significant difference in the effects of ads for some features. Like ads that are pushy appear to be a little bit more effective than ads that are not pushy, but only in 2018. And then when we look again in 2020, that difference goes away. So what we saw was, yes, you can kind of predict effectiveness from features, but those predictors change every year. So it's like, no, you don't get to, we're not going to like arrive at a theory of persuasion that is stable. Here's what you need to do in an ad and it'll be the most effective. No, it changes constantly. Like it's like trying to predict what kind of music people will like.
Yeah, and as a kind of support for that, I know there's been some people at Priorities USA, a left-leaning super PAC, and they've been coding, I think it was posts or advertisements from, I think it was 2020, and they found that the only thing that actually worked in terms of getting engagement consistently was being about COVID, right? Which is once in a 100-year event.
That's so great. Like imagine if you like tried to generalize that theory. Oh, well, in 2050, we're going to make ads about COVID.
Well, we may see in 2024. Who knows?
That's right.
But I'm curious about this Swayable data set because, in a sense, wouldn't campaigners know that these ads are only working within a kind of 0.5 to 1% range because they're getting the testing results back from Swayable, presumably?
That is a great question. Like the prior beliefs, I guess now posterior, but like the current beliefs among practitioners about how good a good ad can be, I still get the sense from people, maybe this is just unfounded, but that everyone's thinking that they could just think their way to a better ad. They imagine that there is that 5-point ad out there they can go get. And they invest a lot of time in being creative about it. It's not to say that effort is wasted because we only ever see the ads that people actually did make. And so maybe it's ads that people invest a lot of effort into are the 0.8 point affect ads, and that if you didn't try hard, they would be just zeros. It could be. It's funny. Our reviewers on that paper, on the Swayable paper, did push us on like, okay, so don't practitioners already know this? So in what way is this new? I was like, I'm not sure that they do know this, but in any case, that's fine.
So interesting. So I want to touch on another study you've done where this is actually conducted on Facebook. So an actual field experiment where during the 2018 US midterms, you were using real ads from a Democratic Political Action Committee and testing the treatment effects on Facebook users in Florida, which is a key battleground state. And you were measuring whether treatment to those ads would affect vote share for Democrats in specific voting precincts. And, the first thing I'd like to ask is how big is the jump from measuring persuasion in a controlled experiment, like we were talking about in the 2016 election, the study that you did there, versus moving into the field and trying to see whether the treatment is actually working and if people are even seeing it at all?
Oh, man, that's such a great question. So this is a study with Don Green and Ethan Porter, and we were trying to do something in retrospect, pretty ambitious. So by taking it to the field, we've got two new challenges relative to the survey environment. Number one, we assign people to treatment, but we don't know whether they take treatment. So we can assign geographically targeted Facebook ads at the zip code level. We can't measure vote outcomes at the zip code level. So that's a second problem. Not only do when we assign everyone in a zip code to see the Facebook ad, they may or may not see it, we can't measure voting outcomes at the zip code level. So we have to measure voting outcomes at the precinct level, which means we we have to do this mapping between zip codes and precincts.
Right. I found that so interesting because the zip codes, which is kind of how you target on Facebook, don't align necessarily with the voting precinct. So you have to do all this matching. This is what I thought was the funnest part reading the paper. I was just thinking, how much kind of database merging were they doing to try to match zip codes and precincts?
This was just playing with shapefiles and messing around for hours and hours. And here's a terrible fact, okay, for your listeners who might be interested in this, is that there are zip codes that are not geographically located. There are zip codes that do not correspond to like a polygon on a map. And it drove me nuts because I assigned those zip codes to treatment or control, but of course could not associate them with any precincts, and I had to throw them out afterwards. Oh my God.
Is that like a post office box or something? I mean, what would explain a zip code that doesn't exist on a map?
Yeah, it's like the vagaries of the postal system. There's a difference between zip codes and zip code tabulation areas. Zip code tabulation areas are polygons on a map that correspond to the most frequent zip code in that spot. Okay, anyway, so that maybe you can delete that because that is the weedsiest weeds I've ever been in a field experimental setting.
But it's very important, right, in order to measure the vote share.
Right. So we just have problems on both sides of the equation. We have problems treating people because you assign them to treat and you don't know if they take it. Then we have a measurement problem. We've got that damn secret ballot, which means you can't just find out how people voted. So you have to use the precinct level returns. Then you have to map from zip codes to precincts. My God. We did all this and we got a very, very clear null, right? Like we just did not move vote share from these Facebook advertisements. We spent a lot of somebody's money allocating them in the world, and just simply could not see an effect on electoral returns. We then put it into context of other studies, and we do a micro meta-analysis of digital ad studies, and find that maybe there's a positive effect, but it could just be that they're not working at the scale that they would need to be in order to affect the kind of change the people who buy Facebook ads wants to affect.
Right. And that had me thinking, campaigners and academics as well often make this distinction between persuasion and mobilization. And so I think from whether it's a political ad context or not, you tend to find this really small effect of persuasion. And I just wonder, should we expect effects on mobilization to be even less, because that is a higher resource activity, arguably, between changing someone's mind a little bit and then asking them to, hey, take a couple hours off work and go to the polling station?
So here's what I've got to say about that, which is, first of all, it's a great question, and I don't think that we know. The best I've got is this study that I did with a team from Acronym, which was a PAC during the 2020 election. A long list of authors, great people on that. So I'll direct your listeners to that paper. So with this team, they were in charge of a full campaign's worth of digital advertising. So like 10 months of ads that are pro-Biden, anti-Trump ads.
And it was like $9 million, right?
It was like a huge amount of money that they spent. 6 battleground states. And what they did is at the beginning, they took out a holdout group of about 500,000 people who would never be shown any of this. So like finally we're getting the RCT in which it's not just one tiny dose of digital ads. Instead, it's like a huge dollop of it. Now, the only thing that we could measure post-treatment, because we were doing this at the individual level, was turnout. We couldn't measure who people voted for. These like a deluge of pro-Biden, anti-Trump ads maybe moved turnout among Biden supporters about plus a third of a point, and maybe decreased turnout among Trump supporters by about a third of a point. So it's symmetric, and it depends on who you support. So if it's advertisement against your candidate, it's slightly demobilizing. If it's advertisement for your candidate, it's slightly mobilizing. That's what we found there. So I mean, like, the firepower in that study is gargantuan, and that's the only way that we were able to uncover such tiny effects.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask, on this one study, you have this, I believe it was $8.9 million ad buy that you were able to measure as a treatment. And then you also have this swayable data with 617 randomized controlled experiments, right?
Yes.
And both are showing these small effects on persuasion, small effects on mobilization. I mean, first, what do digital campaigners need to know in terms of the state of the art here? Because this is only relatively recently we have these sort of effects. And second, I think the argument that most people use is that it's a small effect, but it matters at scale. If you think about 350 million Americans, then that 0.3% turns out to be a lot. So first, what's the state of the art? And second, is that a valid argument that these persuasion effects matter at scale?
Yeah. Listen, I think that the argument that small effects matter at scale is just like obviously true. Like I agree. And that's why we're spending all of this effort, like crazy amounts of, thankfully it's not my money, but it is my effort and time, and I'm spending it because I think it's important. So like, I do agree that even if it's small, it matters for precisely the reason that you outlined, that these things aggregate over many millions of people. On the state of the art, the way I understand what a modern campaign now does is it comes up with a target audience, then uses a creative team to come up with what they think might fit with the campaign's image and the message that they're trying to promote at the moment. Then they come up with a few ideas. They send them off to a company like Swayable. There are others that are doing this work because doing survey experiments is like so easy and scalable relative to a focus group or something like this, and much more reliable. So for the cost of, I don't know, $5,000, they get to find out a ranking of their treatments, and then they can run with the best one of them. If you're a campaign that does that, you are going to outperform a campaign that, when we do the simulations, when you just pick your best guess as to which ad is best based on your intuition, you do better when you do this experimentation paradigm. And so I think that is the state of the art, is constantly learning. There is this, I think it's outside of the state of the art. I think it is beyond what we know about which audiences you should give which messages. So let's talk about that for a second. There is a belief that you can target messages to match with people, and then if you only got the right message to the right person, then you would have a better chance of mobilizing them, a better chance of persuading them. I have seen some studies that do the following. They run an experiment with 10 possible treatments. They then look at segmenting that group of people. They figure out for Republicans who are young and are women, which of the treatments has the highest effect. For people who are Democrats and are old and are men, which treatment has. And then in the second round, they give people the ad that kind of person does best in the second round, and they're able to get a bit of a lift. So targeting does seem to be possible. I've also seen some studies in which the targeted group didn't do better. So that's a paper by Ben Tappan and Luke Hewitt on the targeting stuff, which I really respect. That's to say, the cutting edge is going to be a combination between ad testing and then getting some kind of model for targeting.
Yeah, and I think we're moving that way. I think a lot of this segmented messaging stuff didn't really start, using data behind it till 2012 in Obama's reelection. So it's still kind of early days with the targeting. But I think hopefully for everyone listening, they have a clear idea about really what is the percentage point move that digital ads move. And from your research, it seems like it's not even in the 1% range. But super fascinating research, and there'll be links to all the papers we discussed down in the episode description. So Dr. Coppock, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Oh my gosh, that was such a whirlwind tour. I really enjoyed talking about all that with you. Thank you.
I've just been speaking with Professor Alex Coppock, Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's see what comes up next. I'm working on lining up a few interviews in the short term, so keep your eye on those podcast feeds for when the next podcast drops. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Alamo. See you next time.